All right, hello. Today we're going to talk about breast cancer. We've been doing a series called What is Breast Cancer? And this part of the series has to do with genes and genetic testing. If you don't know much about genes, don't worry about it. It's a relatively new field. Actually, the term genes or genetics was not even coined until 1909. So that's relatively recent. And it wasn't until 2003 when the human genome was mapped out. And that basically is kind of a map of 20 to 25,000 genes that are in the human makeup. Now that sounds like really a lot of genes, but don't worry. Only about 1% of those genes are unique. The rest are shared by every single human being. So that 1% is what we really worry about. That 1% of genes are the genes that determine who we are and make us uniquely us. So that's the genes that determine things like your eye color, your hair color, whether your voice sounds like your mom, things like that. So when we're looking at genetics, let's get a dark color here. You get one gene from your father, and you get another one from your mother. And that's for every single characteristic held in that 1% of that 20 to 25,000. So when we're talking about genes, you're getting a combination of both of your parents. Now, some genes are a little bit stronger than others. We call those dominant genes, and others are not as strong. Those are recessive genes. So for example, you might have two parents who have brown eyes. Well, brown eyes happen to be a pretty dominant gene. So they're both going to show up with brown eyes, but you don't know if the two genes they got from their parents were both for brown eyes or not. So it's very possible that these two parents with brown eyes could have children with either brown eyes or another color, like blue eyes, which is a recessive gene. Now, because the brown is more dominant, if they get even one from either parent, they're going to have brown eyes. So say they have 4 kids. So we'll just kind of draw in green here. Here they are, and they have 4 kids. Okay, they've got 2 girls and 2 boys. Now, of these children, it's likely because there's a brown and a blue, and this one has a brown and a blue, say, that they could have 2 browns, so this one's going to have brown eyes. They could have a brown and a blue, with a brown from here and a blue from here. They could have a blue and a brown, or they could have 2 blues. So the only one that's actually going to have blue eyes is the one with the 2 blues. Now that's getting a little bit deep into dominant and recessive, but you can see why genes don't always show up in a person, and they can carry that gene, and it can go on to the next generation, or even the generation after, depending on other parents. Okay, so we're going to get rid of that. That's not erasing well, but we'll erase that. Again, not erasing well. We'll go on. Okay, so that's genes. Now we're going to talk a little bit about breast cancer genes rather than paying attention to the board there. Breast cancer genes, basically, there are 2 genes that we pay a lot of attention to. They're called BRCA genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And these are basically mutations on a gene, and those mutations cause breast cancer. Now, there may be others that we don't know about. So those are the ones that we're going to talk about primarily, and those are the ones we look for when we're doing genetic testing. Now, let's step back a little bit and look at the big picture. 1 in 8 women in her lifetime will develop breast cancer. And 1 in 100 breast cancer patients is a man. So what that means in terms of genetics is that about 12.5% of the female population will develop breast cancer. And of those, if 5 or 10% are genetic, that means anywhere from 0.625 or 35 to 1.25% of the entire female population might have breast cancer. And because there aren't as many men with breast cancer, even though genetic breast cancer is more common in men statistically than in women, it's still going to be a very, very small number. So we're not talking about a lot of people. But we need to think about what are the ramifications of having a genetic type of breast cancer. Well, there are several. One is you're much more likely to develop breast cancer. So I'm going to give you a few examples here of kind of genetic family genes. So we'll start with Gail, okay? Gail's mother had breast cancer, okay? So there's her mother and her father. Gail had two brothers, first child and last child, an older sister, and herself. Now, of this family, Gail's mother had breast cancer. Her sister had breast cancer. She had breast cancer. Her mother died from the breast cancer. Her sister died from the breast cancer. Gail felt she was very, very lucky because she had a lump that was found early and it was removed and her breast cancer was fine. A few years later, Gail developed ovarian cancer, which is a cancer that's very common, not very common, but still common enough that we worry about it in women who have the breast cancer gene. So she died of ovarian cancer. Now, both of them had one son. Their sons may be at risk, but the risk is much lower. So the point that I want to make with this case is that I don't know what kind of counseling Gail had in terms of her breast cancer or whether or not she was offered or had genetic testing. Most of the time, if you have genetic testing and you have a known BRCA gene, which I'm assuming she did because of the family history, although not sure, then the risk of ovarian cancer is something that's discussed. And quite often a woman has a hysterectomy to have the ovaries removed once she's finished having children so that she doesn't develop that cancer. So had Gail had genetic testing and made that choice, she could have lived a longer life. So that's a reason to do genetic testing. Now, it doesn't always come out that way. I'm going to talk about another person. Her name is Beth. And Beth's mother had breast cancer. Beth's aunt, her mother's sister, had breast cancer. They both, the mother died from breast cancer, the aunt did not. Beth had one sister who also had breast cancer. Hers was treated. Beth also had breast cancer. Now, Beth's sister, when she developed breast cancer, had genetic testing done. She did not have either of the BRCA genes. Beth did not have genetic testing done because her sister was negative. But what she was told was that what she has is something called a family cluster, where there's no known genetic link, although there may be another gene that's implicated there, not one that can be identified. So she and her sister both had breast cancer. No genetic link that we know of. Beth has a daughter and a son. Now, her daughter is very worried that she's going to develop breast cancer too. And genetic testing, because it has not showed up in any other family members, probably is not going to be very helpful for her. So she has a tough decision to make. Does she want to have a prophylactic mastectomy or have her breast taken off to prevent that cancer from developing later? Difficult case. One more person we're going to talk about, I'll come over here because we're running out of space, is Barbara. Now, Barbara her mother had breast cancer, and so her mother had breast cancer and died from breast cancer. Barbara has two sisters. They both had breast cancer, and they died from breast cancer. Barbara decided, now this was a number of years ago, Barbara decided that she did not want breast cancer, so she had a prophylactic mastectomy. We didn't know as much about genetic testing then, so it wasn't until after the mastectomy and years later that Barbara was tested and found out that she did not have the BRCA gene that her sisters and her mother had. So she would have been fine without the mastectomy in most cases. All right, so now we're getting to the genetic testing part. And this is the question that a lot of women ask when they have breast cancer, or they have a family history with breast cancers. Should I have genetic testing done? Yeah, I'll tell you my own story. My family has a very, we'll go back to the dominant gene, a very dominant gene-related form of colon cancer. If you carry that gene, you have over a 90% chance of having colon cancer. My mother had it and she died. My brother had it and he died. So 20-some years ago, after my brother died, I had genetic testing done and there was no genetic link found. Well, years later, I developed breast cancer, not once, but twice. And so I asked my oncologist, should I have genetic testing done again, or was the genetic testing I had done 20 years ago sufficient? Her answer was, well, first of all, we don't know what they tested for, and second of all, genetic testing has come a really long way since you had testing done 20 years ago. So why don't you set up an appointment with a genetic counselor and talk about whether or not you want to have genetic testing done. So what does a genetic counselor do? Well, a genetic counselor does a number of things. First of all, they ask you a whole bunch of questions about your personal health history, your habits, your family history, and they're trying to kind of decide what are your risk factors for the cancer you're talking about, but then for other cancers too that might be related. Like breast cancer and ovarian cancer, breast cancer and colon cancer related. So they're trying to find those things out. They also will talk to you about how you feel about things, trying to help you figure out how you're going to handle the news of your test results. Because if you have that gene and you know you're carrying it around, it's like a ticking time bomb. And how is that going to affect your quality of life? How is that going to affect the quality of life of your family members who know that they may also be carrying that gene? Is that a good thing to know, or is it not a good thing to know? So that's an important factor. You know, for some people, it's very helpful because, like Gail, she could have had a hysterectomy, prevented dying from ovarian cancer. For other people, it's very emotionally taxing. Going back to the colon cancer, before my brother died, he had blood drawn to have genetic testing done to identify the gene that caused his cancer for his children, who were teenagers at the time. Now, that went to his ex-wife because his children were still minors. And I don't know what decision she made about the genetic testing for her children, because carrying the weight of knowing they had that same cancer would be very hard for a teenager. So there are lots of things to consider, and that's where a genetic counselor is very helpful. So if you have a family history or a personal history, a close relative with family history of breast cancer, it is now recommended that you consider genetic testing. If you are considering genetic testing, I would talk to a genetic counselor. I would also keep in mind that insurance does not always cover genetic testing, so that's something that the counselor will talk to you about. And even though at this point in time, testing positive for a genetic link to cancer does not affect your health insurance, it can affect your life insurance. I've been denied life insurance at least once because of my history of breast cancer, even without the genetic testing. But even someone who hasn't had the breast cancer could be denied life insurance if they have been tested and found to carry the gene for breast cancer. So those are things to keep in mind. My recommendation is, if you're worried, talk to your provider, talk to a genetic counselor, make a personal decision that's best for you. If you have questions, feel free to email me, degraciad@hotmail.com. I also have a book out. It's called Reconstructing Hope, Intrusions, Oxymorons, and Transformations in the Breast Cancer Marathon. It is kind of a fun read because it has poetry, it has all kinds of stories from different people, but it also has a lot of helpful information. So that's one resource for you. Also, stay tuned or look at my, my YouTube account. I do have a few other little videos out there. So thank you for your time.